June 4, 1942. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching aircraft return from their strike on Midway Island. Behind him, the controlled chaos of a carrier flight deck in combat filled the air. Deck crews guiding planes into position, ordnance teams hauling bombs and torpedoes, pilots climbing stiffly from cockpits. The morning sun glittered across the Pacific as four massive carriers steamed in tight formation, their decks crowded with aircraft. By every standard Nagumo understood, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Then a radio operator stepped forward and handed him a message slip. The time read 7:28 a.m. The words were brief, typed neatly. 10 ships apparently enemy sighted, bearing 0 and 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read it once, then again. According to officers nearby, his face did not show shock or panic. It went utterly still, motionless, as though his mind had ceased processing the world around him and turned fully inward. For 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable storm. Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Rabaul, Colombo, 2 British capital ships sunk, no serious resistance, no real opposition. And now here, at what was supposed to be a routine operation to seize a small, isolated atoll, American ships were present where no American ships were expected. 10 ships, Nagumo murmured quietly, almost to himself. His staff officers leaned in. Nagumo looked up from the report. "Where are their carriers?" No one answered. No one could. The scout plane that sent the message, a float plane launched from the cruiser Tone, delayed earlier by catapult trouble, had not identified the ship types. They could be cruisers, destroyers, or something far worse. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. "Signal the scout. Ascertain ship types. Maintain. Contact." Below on the flight deck, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga had just climbed out of his aircraft. His plane had led the Midway strike, 108 aircraft that had bombed American installations for over half an hour. Still wearing his flight suit, Tomonaga delivered his assessment to the air operations staff. "A second strike is necessary," he said plainly. "Enemy installations remain operational." That report created an immediate dilemma. When Tomonaga's strike launched before dawn, Nagumo had retained a reserve force, 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended for enemy ships. This was standard doctrine. Always keep a reserve in case enemy carriers appeared. But no carriers had appeared. Instead, the morning had been filled with ineffective attacks from Midway-based aircraft. High-level bombers that missed completely. Torpedo planes that came in slow and were annihilated. Nothing suggested an American carrier force was nearby, so Nagumo had made a decision. At 7:15 a.m., he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews immediately went to work. Torpedoes were removed and wheeled away. Land bombs were brought up. It was complex, careful, time-consuming labor. And now, 13 minutes later, a report claimed enemy ships were out there, 240 miles away. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air planner behind Pearl Harbor, lay in his cabin with a raging fever. He had been ill for days, but refused to stay behind. When officers brought him the news, he pushed himself up on one elbow. "What types?" he asked instantly. "Unknown," an officer replied. "The scout is holding contact. We're awaiting clarification." Genda's flushed face tightened. "If there are carriers," he said firmly, "we must launch immediately, even with only the aircraft currently ready." But Nagumo did not launch. He waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. On Akagi's flight deck, aircraft returning from Midway landed one after another. Handlers rushed to clear space. You could not launch while recovering planes. The deck had to be clear, and the scouts still had not identified the ships. At 7:45 a.m., a second message arrived. Enemy force consists of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief spread visibly across Nagumo's face. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. This was likely a surface force moving to intercept the Midway invasion convoy. A manageable threat. Exactly the sort of target torpedo aircraft were meant to destroy. Except his aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. They were being fitted with land bombs. Nagumo turned to his staff. "Rearm with torpedoes," he ordered. "Prepare to attack the enemy surface force once the Midway strike group is recovered." Below decks, ordnance crews reversed their work. Land bombs were removed. Torpedoes were hauled back into place. It was just after 8 a.m. Midway strike aircraft were still landing. The reserve planes, now being rearmed for the second time, Saskatchewan sat idle in the hangars, while crews worked at frantic speed. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked wherever space allowed, against bulkheads, beside elevators, because there was no time to return them properly to magazines deep within the ship. Then, at 8:20 a.m., a third message arrived. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo stared at the message. Around him, the bridge went silent. Appears to be? Not is, but appears. Captain Tadashi Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, stepped closer. "Admiral," he said carefully, "if there is a carrier, we should launch immediately." "With what?" Nagumo snapped. "Half our aircraft are still recovering from Midway. The rest are being rearmed. The decks are full." He gestured toward the chaos visible through the bridge windows. "We launch a partial strike now. Or we wait 1 hour, recover everything, complete rearming, and launch a full, coordinated attack." This was the decisive moment, the choice that would shape everything that followed. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division aboard Hiryu, observed the same situation and reached a very different conclusion. He sent a signal lamp message to Nagumo's flagship. "Recommend launching attack force immediately." Yamaguchi was known for his aggressiveness, admired for it. Before the battle, he had argued that Japan should commit 6 carriers, not 4, striking with overwhelming power. Now he urged the same principle. Launch whatever aircraft were ready. Get planes into the air. Strike before being struck. But Nagumo was not an aggressive commander. He was careful, deliberate, a man who had advanced by avoiding mistakes. He read Yamaguchi's message and made his decision. They would wait. Recover all aircraft. Complete rearming. Launch a full, properly coordinated strike. It was the doctrinally correct choice. It followed the manuals. It matched everything his training told him was right. So the carriers waited. The Midway strike aircraft landed one by one. Tomonaga's plane touched down last at 8:30, trailing fuel from a ruptured tank. Deck crews shoved aircraft aside. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Ordnance crews below continued their frantic work. The 4 carriers steamed steadily through calm seas, flight decks crowded with planes, hangar decks packed with bombs and torpedoes, crews racing to prepare a strike they now knew would be launched against American carriers that were somewhere nearby, doing exactly the same thing. At 9:18 a.m., the first American aircraft arrived. They were not dive bombers or level bombers. They were torpedo planes. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet, flying low and slow from the east. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol pounced instantly. Zeros dove down. Anti-aircraft. Guns erupted. What followed was slaughter. The Devastators, obsolete and painfully slow, pressed on through walls of fire. They released torpedoes from too far out. Every torpedo missed. 11 of the 15 planes were shot down. The survivors limped away. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo watched grimly. "American torpedo planes," he said. "Poor coordination. Ineffective." He was not wrong. The attack was brave, but futile. No hits, no damage. If this represented American naval aviation, then Japan's superiority in training and equipment remained overwhelming. But the attacks did not stop. At 9:25, 14 more devastators arrived, this time from Enterprise. Zeros and flak tore into them. 10 were destroyed. Again, every torpedo missed. Then at 9:35, 12 more from Yorktown. The pattern repeated. Courageous, doomed attacks, and in doing so, they achieved something critical. They dragged the Japanese fighters down to wave height. They fixed every gun, every eye, every instinct on the low-altitude threat racing in at masthead level, which meant no one was looking up. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed, splitting into attack groups. They had been searching for over an hour. Fuel was dangerously low. They were moments from turning back when McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. He chose to follow it. The ship was Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the carrier force after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. It led McCluskey straight to the carriers. Now he dove toward Akagi. The Japanese did not see them until they were already halfway down. A lookout screamed, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo spun around and looked up. Dark shapes were plunging out of the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. What he said in that instant was never recorded. The bridge erupted in shouted orders. "Hard rudder! Full evasive!" Akagi began to turn, her massive hull responding slowly, too slowly. Bombs fell. One missed, exploding close alongside in a towering geyser. Another struck amidships, punching through to the upper hangar deck. A third hit near the aft elevator. 2 direct hits. Each bomb weighed 1,000 pounds. Each penetrated deep before detonating. Below, on the hangar deck, where ordnance crews had been rearming aircraft for 2 hours, where bombs and torpedoes lay stacked, where fuel lines ran and aviation gasoline pooled, the explosions ignited a nightmare. Fully fueled, fully armed aircraft erupted. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar. Fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Within seconds, the hangar deck became a roaring inferno. Akagi shuddered violently. Smoke poured from elevator shafts. An officer burst onto the bridge, face blackened. "Hangar deck is on. Fire! Multiple explosions! Fire mains losing pressure!" Before Nagumo could reply, another shout came. To starboard, Kaga, Akagi's sister ship, was surrounded by towering columns of water. Then, the bombs hit. 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Kaga's flight deck vanished in flame. Her hangar deck exploded. Within moments, she too was a burning wreck. Then Soryu, smaller, faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs struck her almost simultaneously. Her flight deck peeled back like paper. Fire roared from within. 3 carriers hit within 6 minutes, all burning, all doomed. On Akagi's bridge, smoke began to seep in. The deck tilted slightly beneath Nagumo's feet. The Admiral stood frozen. An officer seized his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." "Lost?" Nagumo repeated quietly, as if the word itself made no sense. "How can she be lost? We were just—" He stopped. Around him, damage reports came in rapid succession. The fires were uncontrollable. The engines still turned, but Akagi could no longer fight the flames or launch aircraft. She was a blazing hulk. Captain Tadashi Aoki appeared on the bridge, his uniform torn, face grim. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." "The battle?" Nagumo echoed. He looked toward Kaga, engulfed in flames, toward Soryu, burning fiercely. 3/4 of Japan's carrier strength, gone in 6 minutes. He turned to his staff. "Where is Hiryu?" "Undamaged," an officer replied. She was separated from the main formation. The dive bombers missed her. "One carrier left." Nagumo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiryu. Launch all available aircraft immediately. Attack the American carriers." At 10:28 a.m., just 6 minutes after the dive bombers struck, Nagumo and his staff descended from Akagi's bridge. The forward deck remained relatively clear of smoke. A destroyer, Nowaki, came alongside. Nagumo crossed over hand on a line. From Nowaki's deck, he watched his flagship burn. Akagi still moved under her own power, but the flames consumed her relentlessly. She could not be saved. An officer nearby later recalled that Nagumo said nothing. He simply stared at the burning carrier, at the smoke pouring skyward, at the fire visible through the hangar openings. His face showed no emotion, not grief, not anger, just a vast, empty stillness. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11 a.m. He stood in the operations room, surrounded by staff officers, when a communications officer handed him a message. Yamamoto read it once, then again. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. "All carriers?" he asked quietly. "3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning, sir. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu remains operational and is launching a counterstrike." Yamamoto stood motionless. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, watched his face. Ugaki would later write that in that moment, Yamamoto seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan not to fight America, yet planned the attack that began the war, now confronted the consequences of his own strategy. He had wagered everything on Midway: the destruction of the American carriers, the securing of Japan's defensive perimeter, and in 6 minutes, the wager had failed. "What is Nagumo's status?" Yamamoto asked. "He has transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara and is attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Order all forces to continue the operation. The main body will support Nagumo. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, our objective may still be achieved." But Ugaki could see that Yamamoto did not believe it. The Admiral sat heavily, and as reports continued to arrive over the next hours, he spoke very little. He issued commands. He made decisions. He maintained the appearance of control, yet something had fractured. Officers who had served with him for years said they had never seen him this way. Not angry, not agitated, but profoundly quiet. Aboard Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi received news of the disaster with a sharp intake of breath. He was on the bridge preparing to launch when the report arrived. 3 carriers burning, an officer said. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Yamaguchi reacted instantly. "Launch everything," he ordered. "Every aircraft we have." At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters lifted off from Hiryu. At 12:45, they located the American carrier Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs. When the report reached Yamaguchi, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now launch the torpedo strike." At 1:30 p.m., 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters took off. At 2:43, they hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. Already damaged, the carrier went dead in the water. To the Japanese pilots returning to Hiryu, Yorktown appeared finished. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, receiving the reports. For a moment, it seemed possible that Hiryu alone might reverse the battle. 1 American carrier damaged, perhaps sinking, if they could find the others. if they could strike again before nightfall, if the Americans failed to locate Hiryu first. But they did not fail. At 5 p.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead. Yamaguchi looked up, saw them descending, and reportedly spoke a single word: Shimada. Damn. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck erupted. Flames tore through the hangar. Within minutes, she burned as fiercely as the carriers lost earlier that day. Smoke poured onto the bridge. The deck began to list as damage reports flooded in. The fires were uncontrollable. Yamaguchi turned calmly to his staff. All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain. His officers protested. Captain Tomeo Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, stepped forward. I will remain as well. Yamaguchi shook his head. The staff will transfer and continue operations. That is an order. But he himself would not leave. He was the division commander. These carriers were his responsibility. 3 were already lost. The 4th, now burned. He would go down with her. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning or sunk. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled the following morning. Kaga sank that evening. Soryu went under at 7:13 p.m. Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9:12 a.m. the next day. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, and Japan's ability to project decisive naval air power across the Pacific. Aboard the cruiser Nagara, Nagumo sat alone in a borrowed cabin, staring at nothing. Officers entered and left, bringing reports, requesting orders. He answered automatically, issuing commands as required. But witnesses later said he seemed distant, his mind elsewhere. At one point, an officer overheard him murmur quietly, almost to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were coming?" It was the correct question. The Americans had known because they had broken Japan's naval codes. They had read the messages, understood the plan, and positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, waiting. Nagumo had sailed into an ambush believing he possessed surprise, believing the Americans were reacting to him, when in truth, they had been watching and waiting. Every assumption was wrong. That American carriers were far away, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still held the initiative, all were false. On Yamamoto received the final reports as night fell. All 4 carriers lost. American carriers still operational. The Midway invasion impossible without air cover. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, he issued the order: occupation of Midway is canceled. All forces will withdraw. Ugaki stood beside him as the order was given. He looked, Ugaki later wrote, like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. Yamamoto had promised the Emperor and the Naval General Staff that this operation would destroy the American carrier force and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Instead, he had lost 4 carriers and achieved nothing. The war, which Japan had dominated for 6 months, had just turned. In the weeks following Midway, as the magnitude of the defeat became undeniable, Japanese naval officers struggled to explain what had occurred. How had 4 carriers been destroyed in 6 minutes? How had American forces appeared at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time? Some blamed misfortune. The delayed scout launch from Tone, the timing of the rearming order, the convergence of American attacks at the worst possible moment. Others blamed Nagumo's caution, Yamaguchi's separation from the main formation, or doctrines that demanded recovery of aircraft before launching strikes. But in private letters, diaries, and quiet conversations, a deeper realization emerged. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the officer who led the Pearl Harbor attack and who spent the Midway battle recovering from surgery aboard Akagi, later wrote, "We believed we held the initiative. We believed the Americans were reacting to us. We believed surprise was on our side. Every belief was wrong. They had known Japan was coming. They had been waiting. The Japanese carriers had sailed into an ambush, convinced they were the hunters, when in reality, they were the prey. This realization delivered a shock deeper than the physical losses. For 6 months, the Kido Butai had operated without restraint. It struck where it chose, when it chose. The enemy had been unable to respond. That era ended at Midway. The Americans had not merely won a battle. They had demonstrated that they could read Japanese intentions, anticipate movements, and position forces to counter them. Japan's entire strategy, rapid expansion, establishment of a defensive perimeter, preservation of elite forces, depended on maintaining the initiative. At Midway, that initiative was lost. It was never regained. Nagumo returned to Japan in quiet disgrace. Though never formally punished, he was removed from carrier command, assigned to shore duties, and later sent to Saipan, where he took his own life in 1944 as American forces overran the island. Yamaguchi went down with Hiryu, one of the few Japanese admirals to die in combat. Yamamoto remained commander of the combined fleet, but in April 1943, American fighters, guided by decoded intelligence, intercepted and shot down his aircraft. Yet on the evening of June 4, 1942, as 4 carriers burned and sank into the Pacific, the Japanese commanders who witnessed the catastrophe struggled to describe what they felt. It was not merely shock at the losses, though the losses were catastrophic. It was not only fear of the consequences, though the consequences would reshape the war. It was something deeper, a sudden, vertiginous realization that everything they believed about their position, their advantage, their inevitable victory, was false. Captain Aoki, who survived the sinking of Akagi and was later rescued from the sea, was asked years afterward what he remembered most about that day. He paused for a long moment. "The silence," he said. "After the bombs struck, after the explosions, there was a moment of complete silence on the bridge. We stood there looking at one another, and no one spoke, because there was nothing to say. We had just watched our entire strategy burn." That silence, that instant of stunned understanding, was the true experience of Midway for the Japanese leadership. Not dramatic speeches, not theatrical reactions, just the quiet, terrible knowledge that the war they believed they were winning had turned, and there was nothing they could do to turn it back.